Interview with Joyce Worley on the 22nd of February 2016. So can I just ask how you initially came into contact with the Bangladeshi community?
Because the Bangladeshi community, when it first arrived, had actually taken a couple of houses in the Chester Road area. That was our catchment area, Thornhill School. And so these children, more or less, without very much warning, actually turned up at the school. Some of the adults could speak reasonable English, so that was helpful. And some of the children actually had a bit of English, but they all needed loads and loads of help. And initially, they were just brought into the school. Nobody knew where to put them, really. So they tended to be put in with the sort of remedial kids and kind of remained at the bottom end because they had these extra needs. Whereas I'm quite sure some of them were a lot brighter than that. But in those days, I mean, going back to 1970s, certainly up in this part of the world, we weren't used to multicultural classes, and so I was concerned from the educational point of view, and as I've already said to you, I was very concerned from the kind of health and safety point of view. When you questioned the kids who could speak a bit of English, and they explained how many people were living in the house, and they explained that there was a very I was going to say it was predominantly male, but it was completely male when they first came over. So far as I know, I certainly didn't come in contact with any females, and that just I was very uncomfortable about that, very uncomfortable. And we had some problems with them. They would tend to have days off and that sort of thing. And I could just see people setting up these businesses thinking this is much more important than you going to school. And I did make a fuss about it with my head and said there's something just not right about this whole setup, you know. And in particular, I'm a bit worried about the children because of this and this, you know, which is basically living in a house full of men with nobody to properly take care of them. And I know that's very sexist these days because, you know, plenty of men raise their kids well, but going back 50 years, it was unusual, very unusual. And anyway, long story short, the head wasn't really interested. He says, you're getting far too involved in the social side of things. Why don't you become a social worker? I got on great with the head, but every now and then he used to have a jibe at me for getting involved with kids. And still was very unhappy about it. And I had a word with the advisor. And he said, we're aware of the problem. He says, we think that we're thinking of setting up a language centre, a language unit. And I thought, oh, brilliant, that's exactly what these kids need. Sadly, when it was set up, it was impossible to teach more than a dozen kids there. The unit was small and it only had 2 teachers. Having said that, the teachers were very good, very, very good, and very pushy, weren't easily manipulated by the authority or anything like that. They would say what the kids wanted and they would fight for it. Unfortunately, at the time, the things I was fighting for was getting the kids to school, getting them washed, getting them to school, and actually checking up to see if they were safe there. And that was the main thing. But even then, you see, this, you hear an awful lot about abuse and people in positions of authority abusing and things like that. There was none of that. Nobody actually... I mean, I went on to be a senior tutor at another school in charge of pastoral, and I was made the key person dealing with social services and abuse things. And I can remember my first meeting, and I was there with a colleague, the school nurse, and we were like, this one came out, couldn't believe it. The number of people who, where abuse was suspected and almost certain, but then the relatives who had come to the meeting were saying, well, I was abused when I was a child and things like that, you know. I mean, the worst thing my father did to us was just not let us be out after 8 o'clock at night or something, you know. And it was like another world. But I'm sure the seamy side was there. But anyway, I was very suspicious of all these men. And Mary used to go out, knock on their doors. I couldn't do that, you see. I mean, I'd been told to mind my own business, really, and get on with teaching. And Mary used to go out, knock on the door. And she was in charge of the unit. And she would just tell them straight. And she'd say it loudly in case they couldn't understand. She always spoke to them loudly. And she used to say, children go to school every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, school, not shop, school. And they would sort of be standing there looking at her. And she used to say, if children miss school, they go to school. If you keep them for shop, back to Bangladesh. On the aeroplane, back to Bangladesh. And she made it pretty clear, you know. And they certainly didn't want to go back to Bangladesh, so the kids started to come to school pretty regularly then. The children themselves were poor little souls, because, I mean, it was a different world to them, you know. And they kept a very low profile. In fact, all the years I was there, on the whole, the Bangladeshis kept a very low profile. You never had naughty kids, you know, they were never disruptive or anything like that. And sometimes within their tutor groups, within their classes, they had people who really protected them. Mm-hmm. And
Bangladeshi kids?
No.
White kids?
Oh, no. They were always spread across classes. Yeah. But I think it was by chance as much as anything. I don't think anybody had even thought of putting them in a group together. I mean, they were just spread across different tutor groups. Everybody got a few. I mean, it was a trickle at first, but then quite a sizable community. And there was, you know, there was plenty of incidents where there was people who were being a bit overpowering with the Bangladeshi kids, and the tutor groups, you know, shouldered up to them and looked after them. So it was quite not a bad atmosphere at all, considering that in a secondary school, a big secondary school at that, because it was a huge school, where you've got that kind of solidarity in a group, it's very helpful to the group. And rapidly, I began to take on informally the liaison with the language department. Very rapidly, the kids started to improve their skills because, of course, they were talking to people all day in English. So, you know, they improved anyway. And I think kids are fantastic learners. Whereas when you get to my age, it takes you all your time to remember what you had for breakfast, you know. And I set up within the school, because it was obviously there wasn't enough kids getting any help, and I set up in the school a sort of sixth form rota, if you like, and it became part of their it wasn't accredited as such, but it became part of their references that they got for when they left school, when they went to uni, that kind of thing, that they'd actually participated in this project. And my husband was a printer at the Echo in Sunderland, and I made him go and get all these boxes of photographs and things, which we usually just chucked out, you know. And he brought all of those, and we started with just words, just naming things, words, talking about pictures. And so usually I had all this going on. I had a really big classroom, so I'd have all that going on at the back. In another corner, I would have all of the Thornhill newspaper. We ran a newspaper there. I ran a newspaper there, and maybe the odd kid working on that, you know, out of somebody else's lesson. And then I had my own classes that I actually ran in there. So always lots going on.
What about religion and cultural issues with the kids?
I can't swear to this, but seeing that RE was on the timetable, I'm afraid they'll have gone to RE as well with everybody else, because it wasn't really thought through. None of us actually knew enough about it. Somebody should have gone off on a fact-finding mission to some school, you know, maybe in the Manchester area or somewhere like that, where they'd been coming for longer and they had some experience in it, but you didn't then. You went in and you taught. You were trained to teach and you taught, and it was practically the same for everybody, except you could use your own creativity. You could take the kids out on, you know, to see art galleries and to see theatre and stuff like that. I used to take my kids all over. So, I mean, their religion, from their point of view, I can't remember tackling it at all.
Right.
And although I'd be very aware of that now, you know, in those days, it just didn't occur to me. I was more concerned with getting them to learn to read and write and to socialise, really. And at the time, I believe that they did have a sort of mosque, but it was like a homemade affair, you know. And certainly there was none of this going to pray 5 times a day or anything. Absolutely not. I don't think the head would have stopped them, but nobody asked. And it didn't dawn on us that, you know...
None of the children ever said anything about their religion or anything?
Well, certainly not to me. But I've got to say, I didn't teach that many of them. I was involved from a kind of slightly senior point of view. Yeah. Just because I had an interest in what was happening to these kids. And they always brought people to me that they didn't know where to put them. So I ended up, they used to bring me all kinds of kids who couldn't fit in anywhere else. They were constantly arriving in the middle of a lesson with, some lad up to there wearing big leather biker gloves. That was one lad I remember came to me and said, "We can't get him to take his gloves off, Mrs. Worley." So I'm not the head, I'm not, so I think I'm going to move him in with you. And, actually I got on very well with him at the finish. But, no, I mean, no, I can see so many failings now, looking back. We had the best of intentions, we really did, but we just didn't have a clue. I didn't know anybody who was Bangladeshi at the time. I mean, my sister wasn't married to Adil then, and I don't know, it wasn't a very, well, it wasn't even a city then, Sunderland, and it wasn't that multicultural. There was very few sort of organised groups of people. So no, those sort of issues weren't addressed properly, certainly not by the school. And we still had, I mean, eventually there was an education committee set up purely for the kind of multicultural element that was creeping into education through Thornhill. And I was on that education committee. And I once took the head along. They said, your head has never been at this meeting, and, would you see if he's interested? Well, I was convinced he was totally disinterested, but anyway, I said, look, they're interested in seeing you. And they came along. God, what a mistake that was. He took the floor a couple of times and sort of said the most appalling things. I'm just trying to remember what the worst of them was now. Things like, we've welcomed them into our school, but they don't want to be like us. We've tried to make them as welcome as possible, and no, they still come in. The girls wearing trousers. Now, believe it or not, in those days we were not allowed to wear trousers, not the staff, the men were, but not the female staff. Yeah. And the reason was that women looked terrible in trousers. And in fact, I did have a one-day rebellion myself where I came and wore trousers. Nobody said anything to me. I flaunted myself up and down the heads corridor, and nobody said a word. And then we got a supply teacher in, and she wore trousers, and she was sent straight back. Wouldn't have her in. So, it was a big thing for him. These girls weren't following his rules. They were coming in with trousers on. And to a certain extent with scarves around their heads, so, and poor little things weren't opening their mouths, so that this was sort of further in when we did start to get some females coming over.
How long was it before the females?
Oh, it was a few years. I mean, I would say it was about, I left in 83. Possibly by about 75. Right. I'm not sure. But gradually, eventually, girls started appearing, women were coming over.
Can you remember what year that you first started teaching Bangladeshi boys?
Well, it was not long after I'd started work at Thornhill School, I think. Well, that was 1970. It was a long time ago. Possibly about 72. 72 maybe. 73. It wasn't right at the beginning when I started there. And And then eventually when the girls came over, well, that was another thing, you know, that they won't stick to the uniform rules. There was always some problem with them, you know, because people like things to stay the same. And heads like to be obeyed. So you had to kid them on they were being obeyed most of the time. And yeah, he actually said that in a meeting. Well, we're actually... The committee was formed to see how we could make these people feel welcome, how we could help them to fit in, and so on. And it was just so pointless to stand up and say something like that. You know, why can't they just be like us? We set them the example. And I can remember thinking, I just wanted to drag him back down to his seat, you know. Because even then, although we weren't very politically correct, even then that just seemed appalling. I mean, why should they want to be like us, for a start?
What did people on the committee say?
We had one very, very good lady, councillor, and she just said to him, well, I'm afraid, Mr. Westland, it's a religious issue as well as a cultural one, and it's not one that we can actually do very much about, I fear. And sort of shut him up like that. But the other councillors just dodged it. Nobody really knew what they were doing. You know, we were finding our way at the time. But we had a very small number of children who found it terribly difficult. Very hard. And one boy that I can remember, he was in such a state. I mean, really now, you'd have social services down on your back. He was only at the school about 3 weeks, and clearly wasn't settling in. Clearly was only about 7-year-old actually. And I've no doubt, you know, as kids are, you know, Dad had gone back and telling all about, you know, and he'd begged to go, begged to go. But he was only a baby. He should never have been allowed to go. And he cried and cried. I've never seen a child cry as much. And I had to get one of the girls that I thought would be really good to look after him out of lessons, for which her teachers were very grateful, because she was a bit of a rough girl, but came from a big family, and stunk of cigarettes, sadly. But you know, I think that was the least of the child's problems. And Tracy looked after him, and she just picked him up, put him on her knee, and said, there, with a great heavy hand. And he fell asleep on her knee almost instantly. And she sat just feeding him with sweets and stuff like that. He could have anything he wanted, you know. I mean, if she used to say to me, he wants such and such. And I used to say, here, take that money, go and get it at the shop. Just go out to school and get it. Go by the back way so the head doesn't see you. And so I had all that going on as well. But I mean that was just plain wrong. He shouldn't have come over. And he did go back very quickly. I think his father or his brother or whatever it was who had him, because they were all my brother and my cousins. And they knew as well. He must have been subbing just like that every night at home. So that was awful. But, you know, it just shows how they get in on paperwork that really is insufficient, to say the least, you know. I mean, not anymore, God, no, not with the terrorism the way it is, but in those days, the code, and that child, I swear, was not more than 7. I mean, literally, you could pick it up and put it on your knee. He was tiny. No way he could have ever passed for 11. And acted like a baby, you know. And I mean, had to when he needed to go to the toilet, Tracy was having to take him to the toilet and everything. He was scared to go on his own, you know. So, but I don't know how much of this sort of thing you really want to put in your book.
This is all good.
But she was very good, that girl. Really, really good. Marvellous with him.
Did you ever meet the adults later on?
Or? I did, yes. They were reluctant in the very early days. Fairly reluctant to spend time talking to you. I think they felt a bit out of their depth as well. They were focused on their business. And every time that you met any of them, they were offering you a free curry. I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure. If it's the kids who are in my class who are cooking it, I wouldn't like to taste it. And no, it was funny. You used to have little lads who would come into your class like that, and they would say, I had Grangetown, they said they couldn't say Grangetown. And obviously they'd moved down there, which was still near the school. And I lived at Grangetown. And they would say, curry house. You come, miss, you come. Have curry, hot. Like this, you know. And I say, oh well, I'll see. I might do. But I never did. And I don't know. There's something about taking taking bribes or something at the back of my mind. Free curries for life. But I can't remember having any really useful conversations with the men. I think they expected to be, it was almost as if they expected to be in trouble. If a teacher spoke to them, they would be in trouble. It was, because as I said, there was a little bit argy-bargy at the beginning with them not sending the kids to school. And I dare say, a reluctance on the kids' part to come to school. That's a big thing, having to go to school. I mean, it wasn't so bad once you got the first few over with. They would bring in the others, as other kids came over, they would bring them in. But it was awful for the first ones, really scary. And we did make efforts to kind of befriend them with kids who were from the Chester Road area, right, and who would no doubt be very grateful for curry. So, that helped as well, because they came then to school in a group of kids. But, they seemed quite, on the whole, they seemed quite happy with their lot. They were quite motivated, they were quite driven. Not in a school sense, not in an educational sense, but certainly to improve their English and develop their sort of skills in that respect, which I suppose, if you're going into that kind of business, you would need.
Do you think would the kids have preferred to have been working in the takeaways than going to school?
I don't think so. I think the kids preferred coming to school because they had mates at school, and they probably realised that it was a far better education than they'd have been getting in a village school somewhere, and I think they were always quite respectful about that. Whereas the local kids, there is a tendency for some of them to just take you for granted and be delighted if they get excluded from school. I know my brother-in-law had to. Well, he set up a school in the immediate village round where he lived, and he sent money back to pay for a teacher. But one teacher in this little school, it's not It's not fantastic, is it? And he paid for it himself, so... And that was... When did Vera get married? Well, I think my sister married him in about 1975, something like that. So it was sort of after that time. It was probably in the 80s before he set the school up and things. So, you know, I definitely think that a school like Thornhill, because we even had a computer in those days, one computer, that was connected to the technical college, and it was called a PET. Yeah, pretty unfortunate, of course, if there'd been French kids there. But yeah, all the nerds used to gather after school, including the nerd teachers, and talk computers on this huge computer thing. Yeah. It's amazing now when you look at the iPhones and things like that, because I'm baffled by them half the time. I'm not sure how much I can sort of say. We did have some high-flying kids from the Asian subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, I should say, and but they tended to be not from that Bangladeshi community. They were very much focused on the business side. They were businessmen. I mean, we had local doctors and their children came to the school and were very school orientated, you know. I mean, they came to all the meetings and things like that. And in fact, I was very good friends with Dr. Rasvi and his family, because their younger son had always been at school, you know, from the infants with my son, and I'd taught the Rasvi family myself. Really nice people. And they did very well at school.
So were Indian kids and Bangladeshi kids in the same classes?
There would be, yes. I mean, we even had, I know this is slightly irrelevant to you, but we even had, at the time of the Iraq-Iran war, there was a boy whose family had fled from Iran. It wasn't Iran, it was Persia, wasn't it?
It was Iran at the time.
Would it be?
Yeah.
Oh yes, it would, because it was the Iraq-Iran war. But he'd been part of, his dad had been part of the sort of Persian upper class sort of. Right. I'm not sure about the cultural influences in that country, but I know very much he was one of the Shah's men rather than. Right. And then when the war came, he fled to England with his family. Right. Ended up in Sunderland for some reason, and the boy actually had very poor English, and he went to the language unit, and he was a big lad. He was about, I would say, 14 maybe, and by absolute chance we had an Iraqi refugee family as well, and again a boy of about 14. Well, it was, you know, it was daggers at dawn sort of thing. Hated each other. No, you know, my uncle got killed and this and that, and Mary, in her inimitable way, just said, "You come in here, you're friends. You're not at war in this classroom. You're friends. And if you can't be friends, you go back." They were always going to go back if they didn't do what you wanted. And Anyway, when I eventually got them into school, I actually thought it was a good idea to get them in to talk about their cultural backgrounds. That was when I first became quite interested in that. And they were very extrovert boys, both of them. And I always remember the Iranian boy coming in. And of course, the girls, were sort of swooning over him. Both of them very, very good looking lads. And he brought in this thing, like a plaited thing that went round his head like that. And some bits of sort of traditional dress and things like that. And he had this thing plaited around his head. And he said, "This is traditional." He says, "We men in Iran wear this." Which was complete lies, because I knew they didn't. I knew that they wore modern clothes. But I was enjoying it so much. And he says, "And do you know what this is for?" Eyeing the girls up. And he just whipped it off. And it was a whip. And he says, "It's to whip my wives with." And these girls, they were like, oh, talk about a fan club, And that went down really well, really well. The Iraqi lad did very well. But you never had the same kind of extrovert outlook coming from the Bangladeshis. Because they were very, I don't know what they'd been told, but, it must have been, keep your head down, we don't want to cause any trouble, all of that kind of thing. And they did remain like that, certainly for a long while. I would say, until they felt really more British altogether, say they'd been going to school since, I don't know, since 1970 or 72 or whatever it was. Once they'd been in the country about 4 or 5 years, then they started to come out of themselves a bit more. And I never heard nobody said to me, "I don't want to join. I don't want to go into the business." It was all business with them, whereas some of because we'd start to get Chinese kids then as well. And some of the Chinese kids would say, "Oh, don't want to work in shop, don't want to work in shop." And if ever they were supposed to speak English all the time they were in school. And I used to say, "Don't speak. You must speak English. You'll never get your English right until you just get used to speaking in English." And they used to say, "But true church tells us no. We must hold on to our cultural roots." And I think there was an awful lot of that with the Bangladeshis, a lot more than I realised. It actually educated me a bit about them, because they kept all that very quiet. Whereas the Chinese would talk about True Jesus Church and whatnot. And I said, "Well, it's up to you." And I says, if you want a life in the shop, or if you want a life at university or whatever. And right, we'll speak English. But no, it became quite multicultural later on. We had kids from all over the place. And there was much better provision. But it took a long time for them to acknowledge that they need to spend money on that area. I think the authority provided the language unit, which was useful, but it couldn't give the kids what they needed. It couldn't possibly. The most anybody got was about, I don't know, 2 mornings a week or something. They just couldn't. They were spread too thin. And it was up to people, well, like me really, in schools, to take it on voluntarily and do something about it. Because certainly in our school there was no real directive from the top about what we should do about it.
Yeah. You said the head was, well, I thought that sort of one size fits all, and they should fit in with what everyone else was doing. What were other staff members' attitudes towards that?
well, you see, in schools you get the whole spectrum of life, and in every place you'll find people who are not keen on the job or who are lazy, and you get people at the other end who live for the job, you know. So I suppose at one end of the school you would have people who just didn't make any effort to accommodate them. Because they weren't being directed from the top, mind, I've got to say. Others who were a bit concerned, and they would, well, when they'd actually approached their particular head of department, he would redirect them to me. Probably just to get it off his plate, you know. But I mean, I was no wiser than the others. I just told them some of the things that I had done and which had worked very well with them. And, you know, the importance of giving them a little bit more time. The thing was, I wasn't officially in charge of them. You know, I didn't have a post for integrating kids from ethnic minorities. I didn't have that. I got that lumbered on me, actually, by accident. So it wasn't something that was a huge topic of conversation, and the fact that they didn't make any trouble meant it was still kept. They could go from lesson to lesson without much, I'm sure, without much progress in some of them. But they weren't a problem either. And this was where the tendency was for them to stay lower down the school, to stay in sort of remedial groups, lower groups. And it wouldn't happen now. It really wouldn't happen. I mean, I think it's marvellous the way it's changed. You know, the way Leslie's got that department. It's absolutely marvellous. And she was another teacher who took the whole thing, you know, pretty seriously. And we used to, you know, take the kids on events and things like that. We used to dream up things to make things more helpful, really. And for the school to be a more welcoming place for them. But of course, she'd sort of gone into the remedial side of teaching. She came into much more contact with them than I did. And when she became head of the kind of special needs department at Thornhill, she made a huge space for them to be taught individually and for opportunities to develop language skills, which was never there before. And you know, I'm just thinking back to the head of the remedial department in the early days. Called him Stan. I mean, he was a nice man, quite a caring man, but I don't think he did anything special for them. He used to, you know, set them work and sit with them, helping them with their reading and things like that, but I don't think he had much idea what he was doing really either. So it was only a question of picking it up as you went along. But the kids learned pretty quickly, but never saw their future as anything else but going into the business. Was always the business.
You said that, I think you said that racism never really manifested itself. But...
Well, if kids have a fight, you know, they'll call each other Specky Four Eyes or whatever they do. And sometimes there was sort of, you know, they would use words like blackie and things like that. But basically it was over in 5 minutes and the same two people were friends again. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't what I would call serious racism, where children are afraid to come to school and where they're being bullied. And of course there was none of the internet bullying or anything that you know, in those days, it was a very simple, much simpler sort of school life. And you did get people who were a bit... I mean, the nearest I ever came to one of them being actually picked on was Dr. Razvi's son, not one of the Bangladeshis, but I think he was a Bangladeshi man, but a professional, you know, a lot of Bangladeshi men came over in response to a plea for doctors, really, and they'd done their training in places like Dhaka, but then came over here and did further training at Edinburgh and places like that. And my brother-in-law among them. And I think he probably came over in the sort of 60s, something like that. But anyway, I had this lovely family. And the oldest boy, very tall, good-looking boy, clever, was being picked on by a boy in one of the bottom sets. We used to set kids, you know. And this one was from set 12, which was just all boys. Set 11 was all girls, set 12 was all boys. I don't know why it was the only group in the school that wasn't mixed, I don't know, but anyway, it wasn't. And I've taught him, I taught Brian, and he was very thick, very big, very strong, and I got on fine with him, but he just took a dislike to this lad, and that was the only time that I thought, he's really racist. I bet if he lived anywhere near him, he'd be picking on him at night and that kind of thing. And but of course, Brian lived right down in the pits of the East End, down near the docks, and the Razvis lived on a nice modern estate. But he picked on him. It was a constant sort of name calling. He'd been spoken to about it. And he said, he says things to me, you know, and it was a bit of this and a bit of that. And he kept challenging him to a fight. And the other lad was, you know, just brushing him off, really. And anyway, this day, he just went too far. And the other lad retaliated and hammered him. And how anybody would hammer Brian, I don't know, because he was like Goliath. And but he did. He hammered him. And then he walked away from the fight, which by then had crowds of kids round, you know, and staff running towards them and whatnot. And walked in, presented himself to the head and said, I've just been in a fight and it was my fault, I started it. And he took all the blame. His parents were distraught. And try as they might, they couldn't get him for to tell his side of the story. And I knew what his side of the story was because I'd spoken to Brian about it myself before. And he was like a hero after that, you know. He was a total hero, even among the white lads, to stand up to Brian. I mean, you know, because strangely enough, the further down the school you got, and I used to teach them regularly myself, I taught that class loads of times, the further down the school you got, the bigger the kids got. There were, you know, you would imagine them being little sort of undernourished kids, and there were a few like that, but there were some giants. You know, only giants in the way that I like look at my grandsons and I think, God, how did you get so big from us, not particularly tall people, and they're all well over 6 foot. I mean, I've got one grandson, he's 6 foot, nearly 6'5". So I don't know where he came from, because his dad's only 5'6". But, largely in those days, men grew to a maximum of about 6 foot, I would say. And he was just mountainous. I don't know how tall he was, but he seemed enormous, and his shoulders were about that wide. And he was a member of the boxing club. But that was probably. I don't think we knew the half of what was going on, but that was probably racism.
His pride must have taken a hit after.
Oh, Brian's. Well, it's very hard to tell what went on in that head, but yes, I'm sure it did. I'm sure that was his only, his one and only bit of self-esteem was that he could flatten anybody that moved, and that everybody was scared of him.
Did things improve after that, or?
Never touched him again. Never went near him again. But in those days, you didn't get many kids who would come and tell the teacher about things that were going on. You do now. Kids still get really annoyed about things like bullying and, and if they're concerned about another child, and they'll come and tell you what's going on. But no, that's the only overt racism that I've seen, and it wasn't much really in the terms of what can happen when there are racist things going on. I mean, people these days, I don't know what's wrong with people. They're relentless in pursuing people for things like that. But I mean, I regularly have a meal round at the at Ministers in Sedgefield, and they were all Sunderland Bangladeshis.
Right.
Yeah, all of them.
Do you have any sense of how things are now, in terms of Bangladeshis in the education system, or?
Oh, I mean, certainly from what I've seen of that big special needs department, I was floored. It was beautiful, a lovely place. Have you been?
No.
Well, it's worth taking a look. I mean, they're well provided for. The only thing that stood out for me, and I was disappointed in the school for that, because we really started to get somewhere. We were at the forefront of multicultural education, if you like, and all happened by chance just because they lived in our catchment area. But what they've got now is fantastic, and it's like a suite of rooms. It's nothing like the old remedial department, which was the smallest classroom in the school, with about a dozen kids in. It's really, really good. They've spent money on it. But the one thing that really bothered me was walking between blocks, because it's obviously been added to the school since I was there, and walking between blocks. They've created like a small yard, and then there's the big main yard, and that was down on 2 levels, but all part of a big main yard. And I was there over lunchtime, and as we walked back across, I went, hang on a minute, why is this yard full of Bangladeshi kids? And Leslie says, they just tend to congregate there. No girls there, mind. Just all boys, all Bangladeshi boys. And I says, why are they there? It's in the dark, that side of the yard, because of the way the buildings were. It was quite dark. And why aren't they in the main yard? And Leslie says, I don't know. She says they just seem to congregate together. And people will congregate together, you know. I says, well, has nobody thought of doing anything about the yard? So she says, well, what do you mean? She says, I don't know what I can do for to stop them. And I said, well, you can close the yard. Put some big gates on there, close them. And they have to just be in the main yard. Oh, I doubt if they would do that. You know, we are a bit overcrowded and all of them. I says, well, I'm sorry, but if it was my school, or if I actually even had any say in the school, I'm afraid I'd be canvassing to get them back in the main yard. I mean, if you don't, it's like discipline in a class. If you don't teach kids, if you don't impose a discipline on them, they're never going to be able to develop self-discipline in later life. And it's the same thing with mixing different races. If you don't impose that on them so that they are mixed, so that there's a certain number in each class, you know, so that there's spread, so they have to mix, then you're not going to get integration. You're just not going to get it. And sadly, the poor little Bangladeshi girls tended to congregate in one of the house bases, out of sight of both yards, hiding in a house base, you know.
Do you think it's quite a self-imposed segregation?
Yes, I think it is. Yeah. I don't think it's...
It's not because of bullying or...
Oh, no, I'm sure it isn't. Although, the more they segregate themselves like that, the more the bullying will occur. Yeah. And this is why I would have them in the main yard altogether. And certainly it should be part of any PSE course. I mean, I'd set up and ran the first year PSE course that we had. So all the first year classes took it. And but after I left, I think they found difficulty running a PSE. For one thing, they had nobody to write the sort of activities, because I used to write all my own stuff as well. They had no one to write it and be creative about it and to lead the teams in a creative way. And in fact, the job went to somebody who was already a head of house and who got an extra point for it. It's such an important part of personal and social education, respecting other people, you know, and if you don't run the courses, well, you can't claim to have taught them how to respect other people, you know, if you don't run it seriously. I mean, when I went to Biddick, I was in charge of all the PSA there, and wrote the courses for every year group as I moved up the school. I mean, other people were part of it as well. And for all it was very much child-centred, the kids weren't making it up themselves. They were led very strongly and put up into different scenarios and so on, so that there was a very, very firm structure behind it. And I think Thornhill would have benefited enormously from that. Yeah. I don't know if they even have a PSE department now. I've no idea. They should have. Every school should have. You know, even if it's only half an hour a week for each class. And there's always the mornings. They get 20 minutes, half an hour in the morning. They should be doing things in that time, not just catching up on gossip while the teacher, you know, sorts a few things out for the lessons. It isn't a catch-up time, it's a teaching time. And I think Thornhill underused that, always underused it.
You haven't kept in touch with any of the Bangladeshi community in Sunderland?
No, not really. Well, I mean, except the locals round the corner.
Yeah.
And They're lovely people, very nice people.
Do you have any sense of how things are with the community through?
Not
other
really,
people?
because I've lived down here now for over 20 years.
Right.
So I'm not, I'm not regularly bumping into people or anything like that. I mean, Leslie's the one that'll tell you all that. She kind of took over my role, right. Which together with the special needs department was perfect, really, because she'd have them through the special needs department and out at the other end. I mean, she was a very good teacher. And as soon as they were ready to move out, and she thought they'd be out and into the mainstream school, which was better for them, both in terms socially and educationally, because some of them were quite bright. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be. I mean, it's same with every cross-section of society. But that has sort of been ignored up till then. If they just coped and learned a bit of English, I think everybody felt that they were doing reasonably well. But no, I haven't kept in touch with them.